funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.
You're listening to Programme 2 of Wanting to Help Others, the three-part series which investigates the stories of various Irish men and women who volunteered their time, skills and services overseas to help empower people and communities in other lands. During the 1980s, Michael O'Sullivan and his wife Anne spent 3 years, from 1982 to 1984, doing volunteer work in Ethiopia with the humanitarian and development agency Concern.
We went to Ethiopia in the summer of '82. We were assigned to this project in a place called Wolaita, southwest of Addis Ababa, approximately 12-14 hours of a drive, fairly tough drive through mountains and all the rest of it.
So what type of volunteer work did Michael and his wife Anne do?
On the one hand, my wife Anne, she would have been working along with this English nun, Sister Colette, and some health workers first of all, they had a main clinic very close to the mission compound, and then I think there was about 5 outreach clinics, some of them that would be 2-3 hours drive from where we are, and in every week they'd hit at least these 5 would be hit at least once a week, as well as trying to maintain their clinic that was very close to the walking distance from the compound, okay? And from my point of view, at that stage in '82, I got myself into a certain amount of logistics work, supplies, things like that.
And in addition to logistics work, Michael O'Sullivan spent much time working alongside an Italian priest to help train locals to improve their irrigation systems.
One of the simple jobs, because one of the problems there, through lack of education and understanding, they used to there are little tributaries of small little water supplies, wells and whatever, but the animals would go and drink in it. The people would come and collect the water out and wouldn't see that there was any harm, because the water itself, from their point of view, was clean. But they forgot about the fact that the animals done their business in it, etc., and the risk of infection and all those type of things. So one of the simple projects that we were involved in, and this Italian priest, who was an engineer by profession before he joined the priesthood, he got very interested in this, and he got guys into building little dams, piping the water so that there was an area where the locals could, and it was running on gravity feed, they can bring their little buckets or pots or whatever and fill their water for drinking water, etc. There was another section then where there was a kind of a slab done out where the women would come and do their washing, etc. And then it led off then to an overflow area where the animals fenced, so that was all fenced away from, but the animals could go and they had their place where they could drink and so forth, okay? So little simple projects like that, a very basic level. So I found myself
greatly improving the lives of the people and health and safe, the hygiene on the ground.
Exactly. If you take from my wife's point of view, she's in with mothers and babies and getting them to understand the whole aspect of hygiene and using clean water and so forth, and getting people to wash regularly to minimise risks of infection, whatever. So there was a complementary piece between what we were doing, trying to improve the source of the water and the cleanliness of it on the one hand, and the like of the work she was doing in the health clinics and that, getting people to understand basic hygiene issues, basic nutrition issues, etc., right? And the whole thing about food preparation and, washing your vegetables, etc., okay? So lots of complementary kind of things happened, So look at, ultimately, we spend 2 very, very, it would be wrong to say enjoyable is a wrong word, but hugely rewarding 2 years in terms of our own personal development and feeling that we were making a contribution and helping people to make their lives that little bit better. Now, the other big thing, and your older listeners and even maybe some not so old will have some recall of Live Aid and Bob Geldof and all that. And our latter 6 months or so in Ethiopia, we didn't come home until the end of 1984. The Ethiopian famine which hit in the mid of 1984 and became a worldwide story. That was, and the area we were in was one of the areas particularly badly affected. So everything became an emergency. We had to try and get in emergency feed and whatever. But people, I suppose, their level of resistance and all that. So you had, I mean, I don't know that I can't say that I personally saw anybody dying before I left Ireland in 1982, but it became a daily and an hourly and even in greater, you saw people literally dying in front of you, you know.
Are you for real, Michael?
Absolutely, really? Yeah. It was, so when I say, you learn a lot about yourself, I suppose, and how you cope and how you work in situations like that. But it was, there was massive food camps where people came into big tented areas, and then the pressure was on. We were trying to get supplies of food in. And then massive work was done in Ireland and in various countries, lots of fundraising, etc., supplies of food, supplies of clothing, all that type of thing, you know.
So just what did the emergency famine relief work entail, which Michael O'Sullivan and his wife Anne did in Ethiopia in 1984?
From my wife's point of view, the emergency work was being in these feeding centres, and basically, unfortunately, particularly people in the health end of it, you almost had to become God and decide, look, there's 50 people waiting today, and I'm just putting it in kind of starter, but it was almost to the point of, you've done certain weights and measurements, and of that 50, I only have enough food for, let's say, 10. I'm just giving you kind of exact, and basically you looked after that 10 and you knew that the other 40, you kept them as comfortable, but they probably weren't going to be around the next day. It was that horrific, right? So on one hand, it was basically about trying to identify those who were at some level of ability to survive and be nourished back to health, versus those who was too far gone, and you try to have a humane, dignified and comfortable ending for them. That was at that side. On my side, I would have spent a lot of time, we were getting in supplies of food, clothing, etc., but the whole planning and logistics and trying to get organised trucks and trying to organise storage at different points. So nearly all of my time became engrossed in trying to organise the logistics end of it in terms of emergency food supplies, emergency clothing, emergency shelters, you name it, So our last 6 months was entirely emergency focused because of the scale of the famine and so forth.
I'd say you couldn't believe it. I'd say there was times, you had to pinch yourself and say, wow. Or did that happen at all? You were just so busy, Michael, and you were in the middle of it that you just didn't even have time to reflect.
In that sense, correct, Paul. I can vividly recall the day we came home, and like everything, some of our families were meeting us and whatever, okay? And we were being driven in from Dublin Airport, and you were passing by and you could see these service stations or shops, and you just could see that there was, whatever people wanted was there. And certainly you didn't see people literally starving on the side of the street,
And Michael O'Sullivan had this to say about the big lessons which he and his wife Anne learnt from their time doing volunteer work in Ethiopia during the 1980s.
We came out of it, I think, as human beings, better, more rounded, having a greater sense of social justice and understandings of the workings of of how people might work together better and so forth. So yeah, look, it would be a very significant cornerstone of our lives.
And staying with volunteering work in Africa, in 2016, journalist Miriam Donoghue spent several months doing volunteer work with a charity called Hospice Africa Uganda in the Ugandan capital of Kampala. So what motivated her to volunteer her time and energies in the first place?
It wasn't in my grand plan initially at all. Like a lot of things in life, it just sort of evolved. I had my own small public relations company. I've been a journalist for many, many years, the last 10 years of those years with the Irish Times. And I moved into another direction, and I worked for a year doing PR for the Irish Hospice Foundation. Through the Hospice Foundation, I became aware of an amazing charity in Uganda called Hospice Africa Uganda, and they support people who are near end of life. Mainly with pain relief. They ensure a dignified, pain-free end of life. In Uganda, the health system is really poor. People with cancers can't access treatments like we would here, radiotherapy, chemotherapy, surgery. So if you have cancer, it's really a death sentence. And the Irish Hospice Foundation were very good and supported this organisation in Uganda, led by a woman with strong Irish links, Dr. Anne Merriman. So I met Dr. Anne Merriman when she was in Dublin, visiting the Hospice Foundation, and I was at a crossroads in my own personal life. I had become separated, a very sad marriage separation, and I was a little bit all over the place. And Dr. Anne Merriman sort of took me out for lunch one day and said, "You stop feeling sorry for yourself. Come out to Uganda, give us 2 weeks of your time, and tell us how we can help tell our story better in order to get more funds to expand and to do more good work." And I said, all right, I'll do that. So I booked a return flight to Uganda for 2 weeks, and off I went, regarding this as maybe semi-holiday, semi-break. 4 days into my visit to Uganda, I called my 2 kids, and they were at that stage in their early 20s, and I said, I'm not coming home. So I was hooked straight away, and I decided to give time, I left it open-ended, to volunteer for Hospice Africa Uganda and to give them as much assistance as I could. And that's how I got into volunteering for a charity.
How long did you spend out there in total?
In the end, I spent 8 months out there. So I arrived in early January 2016, came back in September 2016. So I knew 2 weeks wasn't going to be enough to do what needed to be done there. They needed to build up a whole communication system, fundraising team, do a strategy, and so I wrote that strategy. I helped the hospice hire a communications officer full-time, a fundraising manager full-time. I got involved a lot in advocacy, in lobbying, as much as you can lobby in a place like Uganda, getting our message out there, trying to get some funding from corporates in Uganda, lots of meetings with Ministry for Health to get more support for the palliative care work that the hospice was carrying out. So I was very busy, it was full on.
But before Miriam Donoghue got busy working, she first had to learn more about Hospice Africa Uganda itself.
I decided on my first day in hospice, I'll never forget it, I arrived the previous day. I wanted to get stuck in straight away. It was very, very hot. It was all very new to me, different culture. And on my first day in hospice, I felt in order to help them get their communications messaging together, I needed to go and see on the ground for a few days the work they did. So I went into the clinical team and I said, I want to go with you today when you visit patients. And they looked at me and thought, is this woman a bit crazy? And I said, no, I do. I need to go and see for myself. And they warned me it was going to be tough. And I said, that's fine. I can cope with that. Now, to explain hospice, Africa Uganda, they didn't have a hospice on site as such. They delivered palliative care to people in their homes. And when I say people in their homes, I'm talking about people in very, very humble conditions. Their homes might be, in slum areas of the city, might be just one room with no running water, no electricity, very little food. And my very first visit, I was really taken aback when, we arrived in a little van And I was with a nurse called Rose Light and a doctor called Dr. Stephen, two wonderful Ugandans. And in we went to a patient called Jovia. And she was in one room on a dirty mattress. Her younger brother was her only carer and minder. And she had cervical cancer and AIDS. And she was 29 years of age. And she was very, very weak and very ill at that stage. And when she saw the hospice team, her eyes lit up. The visit from hospice, the fact that they looked after, not just pain relief, but their spiritual care, left some money for food, were trying to get some money as well to educate Jovi's daughter, who was 12, who didn't have school fees to go to school. So I was really moved by this, and I just thought this was incredible work. And on day 2, I went on another visit and saw more patients. And by day 4, I decided I wasn't going home.
Wow.
So it was profound. Yeah. And I always felt through it that I was privileged. I was privileged to be there. I was privileged to have the opportunity. My children were working. They were doing for themselves. I didn't have massive financial pressures, and I was in a position that I could go and do this.
So where does Miriam feel she had the most positive impact in her volunteer work in Uganda with Hospice Africa, Uganda?
I suppose using my comm skills, there was a few things. I set up a crowdfunding page through my Facebook account, and in the 8 months I was there, I raised €30,000. So that was enough to pay for 4 nurses for a year. So I was, with the help and support of friends and family, and I was sort of proud of that. I was saying, that was a small impact, but, I can look back and think, well, it was something. So, just telling the stories of the patients through video and through pictures. Managed to get a lot of exposure for hospice in terms of media, which is where my skill set would lie, say, in international media. And in local media, I wrote a big article for the Sunday Independent while I was there. Dr. Anne Merriman, I had her on BBC World when I was there. So I managed to link hospice with a lot of media and journalists, which certainly did help raise their profile. And with donors, need to have confidence in charities that they're supporting. And, positive press and showing the positive work and impact of the work is always very helpful when you are either looking for money or support from new donors, or if you want to show current donors, this is what we're doing. And we're getting, the public acknowledgement for that. So I think that was important.
So what are the big lessons which Miriam Donoghue learned from her volunteer work in Uganda?
I suppose the biggest lesson I learned is that there's a whole other side to life for people that we don't really appreciate in a very well-developed country like Ireland. And I suppose it taught me how to appreciate what I have. And I suppose it taught me the huge inequalities that there is in this world as well, because until you see it yourself on the ground, it's hard to really get a proper picture for the two worlds that we unfortunately have.
The haves and the have-nots.
The haves and the have-nots. So it was a great life experience for me, and again, I was privileged. I was lucky. In my early 50s, I was in a position to do it. Not everyone is in that position.
And staying with volunteering in Africa, Barry Tracy from County Cork spent 3 years from 1985 to 1988 doing volunteer teaching work in the newly independent southern African country of Zimbabwe. Barry Tracy.
When I finished college a long time ago, there was no work here. So Robert Mugabe had taken over from Ian Smith.
This is in the 1980s.
Yeah. So Mugabe took over from Ian Smith and promised free education to all Zimbabweans, but realised that he had no teachers. So Mugabe would have had contacts with Ireland, probably primarily through missionaries over the years. Contacted the Department of Education, and the department said, "Okay, we'll get you a few teachers." So, if I remember right, it was 50 of us went out to Zimbabwe
as volunteers.
Well, we were paid local wages, but effectively you were a volunteer. I made no money there. I think in some cases I had to write home to sort of ask them to send me out a few bob.
Keep me alive, please.
Keep me alive. So we went out there, 50 of us, raw out of college, and it was probably the best experience of my life.
Why, Barry?
I had no idea where I was going to. I had no idea what I was facing, and I was just taking a major chance. So we arrived in Harare, the capital city. I was teaching in a township outside Harare, nearly 4,000 students. Myself and there was another South African teacher. He was a history teacher. We're the only two whites. So we're the only two whites you'd meet. We had ourselves in the morning, that was it. And by the time you came back, we were the only two whites you'd meet. So it was in the township. It was in a huge school. I was teaching O-level English. So one of the challenges was teaching, for example, Charles Dickens' Hard Times, and the sun was beating off the roof in your classroom. So there you had to sort of think of different ways to try and get the concept of Hard Times and Dickens, because it certainly wasn't Dixonian out there. So teaching there, and they were just so into education, so into learning. I distinctly remember you work for 3 months and you had a month off. So in that month off, we would travel, so I would have seen all of Southern Africa. But when you came back after your month's holidays, the students would have, over the month, written numerous essays and asked you to mark them. So the minute you came back and on your first day, you had a backlog of a bunch of essays already. They were just so enthusiastic to learn. And they would be constantly asking you questions and constantly picking your brain. And it was just such a joy to go into a classroom where people wanted to learn and they were interested. I'd say if I had no disciplinary issues in the 3 years I was there, not one issue.
I mean, they were so hungry to get on, to progress and to learn. I mean, it was education at its best. As you said, discipline, not an issue.
No, not an issue. Like, this was their way of getting out of their township and getting out of where they were born. They wanted to better themselves. And education was their number one aim, to go through O-levels and then possibly A-levels, because they were using the English system, and then try and go on to college. So like it was a joy to teach, because they were just so enthusiastic. I came back to Ireland after 3 years and it was a different story then. I had. But like,
I'd say you got the shock of your life. Oh, put me back in Zimbabwe, please.
Certainly did. It was a different world altogether.
And I also asked Barry Tracy just what did the typical teaching day in school entail.
Such was the demand for seats in the classroom, they had to devise a system called hot seating. So there was 2 shifts basically. So there was a morning shift, which would start at 6 until probably 1 o'clock. Then there was a second shift in the afternoon that would last from maybe 2 until maybe 7. So you could be on a morning shift or an evening shift. So they got mileage out of their schools, I may say, and the fact that...
so you weren't going to be left idle, put it that way?
Certainly not. It was tough going. But it was the fact that they were so enthusiastic and so open made up for any of the extra work you did. You wouldn't have even thought about it. And plus the fact that in my early mid-20s you were full of energy, and that wouldn't happen now, of course. But like from that point of view, like you worked hard for 3 months. You worked very hard. So we'd enjoyed our month off, and you would head off to every country in Southern Africa. We would hitch around the place. I wouldn't be doing it now. Different times then. And then come back after your month's holidays, and they would have spent the month writing essays and extra work that you hadn't even planned for. But in some ways that was good. They were just so enthusiastic.
And Barry Tracy also had this to say about some of the challenges which he faced in Zimbabwe during the 1980s.
The challenges were, like, you were in a totally strange country, and you were automatically assumed that if you were white, you were what we would call a Rhodesian, and quite a few of them that I would have met would have been very, very not very nice people. So you were painted with that brush. And I remember one instance, I went for a drink one Friday evening, and I was in a bar in a township, and I was the only white person in there, and the results came on. There was an election, the results came on the television, and Ian Smith had regained his seat. And I could feel noises coming towards me and people sort of brushing off me, and I said, I think I better get out of here. They had no idea who I was in this place, until one of my colleagues, I didn't know he was there, stood up on the table and explained to all the people in the bar who I was, that I was Irish, that we had been downtrodden like the Zimbabweans were, and that I was over here helping the people, and the whole atmosphere just switched. I mean, I had free drinks for the night.
Congratulations. Well, thank that colleague.
Yeah, like,
you're lucky he was there.
I am. I don't know what would have happened.
And Barry, just where do you think you had the most positive impact in your 3 years volunteer teaching out in Zimbabwe?
At the end of the second year, some of the students would have taken their O-level exams, and some of the results were very, very good. Because, put into context, you're trying to teach O-level English, which is basically a curriculum based in England, in Zimbabwe, for heat of up to 35, 36, 37 degrees. And you're trying to teach, and so
Jane Austen, whatever it is,
Totally.
the Bronte sisters and all that, and they're talking about the Yorkshire moors, and here you are, in southern Africa.
Totally. So, you had to think on your feet. So, for example, we would devise 2 or 3 plays based around, say, hard times and the concepts of hard times. And you try and we organised 2 or 3 local plays to try and get the concept of what was being taught in hard times and onto a local context. And that in itself was very challenging, but it was very fruitful, because they could see exactly some of the lessons that Dickens was trying to get across in hard times. We were trying to translate those into a local context within their township, and that certainly worked. And that was very, very rewarding.
And I also asked Barry Tracy whether he'd any advice for anyone who might be thinking about volunteering overseas.
I would certainly say just go for it. And nowadays you have a lot more support, you have a lot more contact with people. You have your Twitter and you have your Facebook, and I'd certainly just go for it. And just the whole experience from your own personal well-being, to get out of your own little routine here in Ireland and go and experience someone else's life.
And expand your horizons.
Totally. And you'll have a totally different view in life from that. You certainly, and it will always live with you.
And to hear more inspirational stories of Irish people doing volunteer work overseas, then make sure to catch our next number 3 programme in this 3-part Wanting to Help Others series. Until then, I'm going to leave the last word with various contributors.
The best thing about volunteering overseas for me, I suppose, was to help those people to help themselves.
It's actually that whole thing of empowering people to help themselves, because they are well able.
We managed to save a lot of people, and we managed to give people a new start that they may not have got before, so that was wonderful as well.
If you can do something that's meaningful, help somebody who's less fortunate, there's a contentment that you can derive from that money can't buy, literally.
Funded by the Broadcasting Authority of Ireland with the television licence fee.